For 24 years, I was an enlisted guy, much like Luke Marino yesterday. I actually served with his father, and the beginning number of years that Lucas was in. I was an enlisted guy. I started out as a machinery technician, which means anything mechanical. So HVAC, hydraulics, engines of all types, from steam propulsion. Believe it or not, we still had some steam-operated vessels back when I came in 1979. Jimmy Carter was president, if you're counting. I went in when I was 17. So my brain was not fully formed, but I was somebody that was really bought into the search and rescue mission of the Coast Guard. My hero was a guy named Joshua James. He was back in the 1800s. He's credited with saving over 1,000 lives. And Congress actually created a couple of medals, the gold and silver life-saving medal, for him and his crew. It was, when we talk about safety issues back then, the search and rescue motto was, you have to go out, you don't have to come back. We wore that as a badge of honor, right? Somebody's in distress, offshore, heavy seas, we're going. There was never a question, right? Some of that, as Luke mentioned yesterday, some of that culture has changed. Now it's you have to do an evaluation of the sea state. It's much like when a hurricane goes through and they tell EMS and police departments to shelter in place until the hurricane passes, then they go out, right? Because it does no good if the first responders can't make it, right? So anyway, after I was enlisted for a while, I was doing coastal search and rescue in New England predominantly, then went to a ship out of Boston. From there, I was picked up for officer candidate school. It's a very selective program, and came out of that, went to 2 additional ships as assistant engineer, chief engineer, then I had a couple of shoreside assignments supporting ships. The interesting thing is in the Coast Guard, we got a lot of leadership training and tons of mentoring. We saw all sorts of leadership styles, all sorts of followership styles. In 2003, I left the service and started doing consulting work. And I would go into these facilities, all sorts of different facilities, everything from chemical plants, oil refineries, open pit mines, pharmaceutical, large research universities, anything that had physical assets. And invariably, if I was going in to do an assessment to see how their maintenance program was functioning, their maintenance and reliability program, invariably when I was doing the assessment, I would see a binder sitting on a shelf from some other consulting firm that was in there 5 or 6 years earlier, and you pull it off the shelf and flip through it, and all the stuff that's in that binder looked great. It's within 90% of the same stuff that I'm going to tell them to do, right, or recommend to them to do. So then you ask the question, well, if you did it back then, why isn't it working? Why am I here now? If it was reasonable, good material, good processes and procedures, why isn't it working? And this would happen time and time again. So I started thinking about, why is that? You start peeling back the onion. Why does a good process fall down? It gets implemented, they have a pizza party, everybody gets high fives, the senior managers get bonuses, they move on to other jobs, and the performance slides back down. And my conclusion to that, after having had a great background in leadership and mentoring and all that within the Coast Guard, when I went into civilian locations, that was not very well done. Accountability and leadership capability, to me, are the 2 fundamental things that are required to get any sort of process, procedure, any sort of culture built within an organization. You need those 2 things. A couple other things I would love for you to keep in mind as I go through this. One is that the models that I'm going to show you, this is a community of human and organization learning, right? The models that I'm going to show you will work for humans, individuals, and it will also work for an entire organization. Unfortunately, most of the people I train, I'm training for them to be able to apply it for themselves in their department. And it's very rare that I get an entire organization that wants to go through this. But the point being that it's modular. You can do it for yourself, your responsibilities, or you can put it in for all of the responsibilities within the plant or within the organization, okay? So let's get moving. First thing is I've been living a good life lately. I had a bucket list trip to Scotland and Ireland last September. Myself and a friend of mine, we golf together all the time. We both turned 60, so we wanted to do a bucket list trip. One big recommendation for you, if you're going to do a bucket list trip when you're 60, do it when you're 50. My knees were barking. So I'm having a really good time in this group because I see a lot of similarities and I see a lot of things that are a little bit different. Most of the things that there are differences, it's mostly about language. The same themes or the same issues are there, and the same solutions are there. It's just we might use a little bit different language. I come from the operations, maintenance, and reliability strain, if you will. And so safety is heavily involved in those things as well. Organizational performance, obviously, is front and center. So as I go through these things, if you hear me use a term and you want me to clarify what I mean by that term, because I'm not from this community historically, please let me know. So one thing is that changes are often required to improve safety or business performance. Changes are made to address ambiguities, gaps, overlaps in how things are versus what the desired state will be. And what I'll say about this is ambiguities, gaps, and overlaps, that's where conflict and silos live, right? Ambiguities mean something's not clear. Gaps means something's not covered, and overlaps are situations where you may have two entities that are being told to do the same thing, right? So there's conflict, or there's silos. People get protective of their space. So some examples, if we're trying to put in place human resources policies or practices, if we're trying to improve work management processes or operator perform maintenance, those sorts of things, right? And it could be a very simple thing, like putting a tool checkout in a single shop, or it could be a massive thing, like implementing lean across an entire organization. The easy part is defining and initially implementing the changes. Now, some may argue with that a bit because depending on the scale and scope of what the change is going to be, it could take a massive amount of time and effort to design what those changes are to be, right? But I would argue that the hardest part is actually perpetuating change. Once it's been implemented, and then trying to sustain it, keep it going. So let me start out. I have a very simple definition of what culture is. My definition is culture is what most people do most of the time. What people do are behaviors. And one of the things in my Coast Guard leadership training was, you never know what somebody is thinking. They can give you body language, they can verbalize, and they can say things, but that may or may not be what they actually believe or what they're actually thinking. So what you can do is you can observe behaviors. So when I talk about behaviors, that's why I'm talking about behaviors, because I can't control what somebody thinks about what I'm asking them to do, but I can always observe their behaviors. I can know whether they're complying or not complying, right? So to get the right behaviors, a leader has to define and enable the right behaviors. So define is putting guidance in place, policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures. And enabling means putting in place the right assets or the resources that are needed to carry out that guidance. That includes providing training. All right? So we want to guide those behaviors consistently over time. So when people repeat the right behaviors often enough, they get to the right habits. And I was heartened to see in the book selection up here, there's this book. And I'm actually going to reference this a little bit later in the presentation. This is Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit, right? And that's where a lot of this thought process came to me. Also did a lot of study on brain science. So I was really happy when Martha was talking about that earlier this morning. So when most people have the right habits, we get the right culture. Okay, so culture is what most people do most of the time. What people do are behaviors. So if we want to get the right behaviors, we have to explain to them what are the right behaviors that we're asking of you, right? So just think about this little model, and I apologize if the green boxes don't show up too well in the back of the room, but on the bottom it says define and enable the right behaviors. On the left and on the right it says guide the right behaviors. So if we define and enable, and then we consistently guide the right behaviors, we can create the right habits. If we create the right habits, we can get the right culture, because remember, culture is what most people do most of the time, right? So this is a little difficult to read too, but this is a sign, a bulletin board at my golf course. And in the upper right corner it says golf carts must be returned by sunset. Right next to it is a sign that says all golf carts must be off the golf course by 16:30. I plan a military course, Patrick Space Force Base, so that's 4:30 p.m. So which is it? Is it sunset or 4:30? Well, it kind of depends on what time of year it is, right? It could coincide, but most of the time it doesn't. So that's an example of where there can be ambiguities, gaps, and overlaps. So if we're going to try to define and enable the right behaviors, there's all sorts of models that can be applied, but they all generally boil down to, number one, knowing the value of the improvement or the change that you're trying to make. Assess what the current behaviors are so you can kind of see where the gaps are. You identify those gaps between the desired behavior and what you're currently doing. Then you document maybe with flow charts, and then you maybe do a RASI table to identify who's accountable, responsible, who supports, who gets information, right? And then you assemble the guidance into a document, and you call that your guidance, right? Your policy, plan, process, procedure, or measures. And then you provide the resources and the training so that you can then implement that change. Then you implement, right? So again, when we look at this model, the easy part is defining and enabling the right behaviors. We know what we want folks to do. And notice I'm not getting into the details of how you define it, because there's all sorts of different models. Obviously, the best models are when you involve the people who are going to have to live with those guidance documents, the guidance that you're giving them. You want them to participate in generating the document, right, the guidance. So that's a best practice. But again, the difficult part for sustaining a change is to guide the right behaviors. And we're not guiding the right behaviors just during implementation. We have to guide the right behaviors throughout the life of this guidance. So, one of the things in guiding the right behavior, it depends on accountability and leadership capability. And when I talk about accountability, well, remember the RASI table I just had on item number 5 or whatever it was there? RASI, some people use RACI, there's other iterations of it. But when you build that RASI table, how many accountable people can there be on each row? There can be only one, right? You can have lots of people being responsible, but there can only be one person that's accountable for each activity, each phase, each task, right? Because we need to know when that is not happening, who's accountable to fix it, right? And that's true of leadership, and it's also true of the people that are working on the system. So the right habits are a consequence of consistently guiding the right behaviors. And so if we work backwards, we think about how habits are formed, and then the importance of having the right habits, right behaviors. Okay, and that's where Charles Duhigg's book comes in. So we're going to talk a bit about the brain. What we do when we load information, like sitting here this week, listening to presentations, reading, interacting with people, you're loading information into your short-term memory. I think it was Mr. Fisher yesterday that said somebody is only 2 weeks smarter than somebody else because they can get training. Well, I agree with that to a point, but remember when you have button seat training, you only retain about 10 to 20% of what you learn unless you use it, right? Once you use it and start applying it, then it starts getting locked into long-term memory. So this is what happens. You get short-term memories. They are unstable. They only last for a few moments. And again, my golfing background, if I get introduced to somebody on the first tee and I say, hey, my name's Tom, and they say, well, my name's Jim, we hit our tee shots. By the time I get to where my tee shot landed, not because I hit it far, but just it's a couple of minutes, oftentimes I forget what the guy's name was, right? So I got the habit of writing his name down on my scorecard right away to try to put a control in for that, right? But that's because it's a short-term memory. Those neuron connections, the synapses, have not strengthened, and they probably won't strengthen because I may never see this fellow again, but they only linger for a few seconds to a few minutes. So what we have to do is consolidate those memories from short-term to long-term. Short-term memories can be extended. You might remember things for a few hours up to a couple of days, but they're still weak synapses, weak connections. So those won't be sustainable. So again, sitting in a conference like this, a workshop, whatever, training events, they load a lot of information into the short-term memory. But if we don't consolidate that short-term into a long-term memory, we're going to lose it. So who remembers what the name of this equation is? What is it? Pythagorean equation. So this is an example of a long-term memory, right? You were in school, and the teacher showed you how it worked on the board, and then they gave you a couple of in-class quizzes, then homework, and then you had to take an actual quiz or a test, and then at the end of the year there was a final and you had to go back and get it again, right? That's an example of repetition. So behaviors in long-term memory, we want to establish consistent recurring behaviors, right? That's our goal. We want to get the culture and those habits going. Repeated behaviors consolidate short-term into long-term memory. So getting all those different iterations of the Pythagorean theorem made that repetition strengthen those neuron connections. And so recurring behaviors are based on long-term memories. So there's reactions, right? So if you put your hand on a hot stove, you'll pull your hand away. But most behaviors are based on long-term memories, things that we want people to do repeatedly, right? Check the torque on this bolt. Well, how do you check the torque, right? This is a really good thing for our human species. So when a behavior has been performed often, there's a shift that occurs in the brain, right? It moves from effortful thinking into recognition of routines. That's when you know you have a habit. So defining and enabling the right behaviors provides the desired behaviors, and repeating those behaviors over and over consolidates those short-term memories into long-term memories. That's what's functioning in your brain. That's what's happening in your brain. So there's 4 ways that you can consolidate a short-term memory to a long-term memory. Right? The first way is what we've already discussed, spaced repetition. That's the Pythagorean equation example. There's also pattern hooks. There's 2 types of ways that we can use pattern hooks. The way your brain works is it logs similar types of information in similar portions of your brain. So when you go to retrieve something, it's much easier if there's a lot of hooks on it, right? And so what happens with engaging multiple senses, an example of that is when you're learning to drive your car, right? You felt the weight of yourself on the seat of the car, your hands you're feeling on the steering wheel, you're hearing the person that's instructing you, giving you recommendations and instruction on how to drive, you're feeling the acceleration when you hit the gas and the deceleration when you hit the brakes. Maybe you're hearing honks, horns honking if you're doing something not right. but you're engaging all of your senses, your vision, you're seeing relative speed outside of the vehicle, right? All these different senses are creating pattern hooks. So the more pattern hooks you have and can integrate, the quicker the learning is, the quicker the consolidation from short-term to long-term. Similar circumstances, this is another place where there's pattern hooks. So an example of similar circumstances is computer-based training, right? So oftentimes if you're learning a new software suite, an EAM or something like that, the vendors set up a sandbox, and you can go, there's some data in the sandbox, and you can go in there and try all these different iterations on, different screens, and if I hit this button, what happens? It's teaching you how to use the screens for real, but it's in a safe environment. Another one would be flight simulators, right? So people going into flight simulators, learning how to operate aircraft. The fourth way is traumatic experiences, right? So that might be witnessing a car crash. In my case, I was in a food and beverage facility maybe 10 years ago now, and there was a contractor in there. They were building a platform above a process, and they had temporary railings up, and I was just walking through there with the sponsor, the guy I was working with, and this poor fellow went to lean against one of the temporary railings that wasn't secured. He came down, 12 feet or so. It was pretty ugly. It's burned in here because I saw it happen, right? So that's an example of a traumatic experience. So those are the ways that you can consolidate short-term to long-term memory. And the whole point here is we want to make sure that we establish a long-term memory because that's where habits come from. So how many of you are hockey fans? Okay, this is not Brad Marchand. It may be Matt Tkachuk, I'm not sure, but that's a hockey joke. I'm a Bruins fan, by the way, so I'm still not over the first round loss. But anyway, so this is an example of what's in Charles Duhigg's book, and this got me thinking quite a lot. The first thing is, so they set up this experiment, and they run the experiment multiple times. They set up this little T-shaped maze. You can see there's a little gate here, and what happens is they click the gate open, and then the rat comes out, and the first time that he runs the maze, he doesn't know where the reward is, so he goes all over the place, finally finds the treat. Well, they put him back at the starting gate, and they rerun it many, many times, right? So the reward is always left in the same location. The partition's removed, the rat searches for the reward, finds the reward. They do this over and over and over. So what happens? Well, if they put sensors on the rat's brain and they can look at the brain activity, the rat brains are actually a pretty good analog for the human cerebral cortex and basal ganglia. Okay, so what happens? This is what the brain waves look like on the initial maze run, right? It's kind of very high level, all over the place. After multiple iterations, many, many runs through the maze, that's what the brain pattern looks like. And the interesting part is the part in the middle, right? This is what happens when the thought processing moves from the cerebral cortex into the basal ganglia, right? The cerebral cortex takes a lot of energy to operate. It's effortful thought, right? Effortful thinking. The basal ganglia recognizes patterns and just executes the patterns. And this is a really good thing. If we didn't have this, if humans didn't have this capability, you'd have to relearn to tie your shoes every day, right? It's an amazing feature that we were evolved to. So now creating habits and exercising neuron connections, right? So the first thing, let's talk just a little bit of biology here. Our bodies, we consume, or we need about 2,000 calories per day, the average person. About more than a quarter of that is consumed by our brains. The rest of it is consumed by our respiration, our digestion, our heartbeat, our muscles, and those sorts of things. But about a little more than 25% is consumed by our brains. Within that 25%, 80% of that 25% is consumed by our cerebral cortex. It is by far the biggest consumer of energy in our brain. The basal ganglia, on the other hand, consumes very little energy. So what happens from that rat example, when we run the same behaviors over and over again, and we shift from the cerebral cortex into the basal ganglia, that's when a habit is formed. Okay? So think about the last time you're driving home from work, at the end of the day, and assuming you've lived in the same place for 6 months or more, as you're driving home, you're not really thinking about how much weight you're putting on the steering wheel or how you're hitting the gas or the brakes. You're just doing it. And you're probably thinking about your kid's soccer game or, a golf match coming up this weekend or something. But you're not focused or not concentrating on driving. That's because the basal ganglia is in charge. And probably when you get home, if you have a driveway or a designated parking spot, you probably park within 3 inches of where you left in the morning without even thinking about it, right? It's that good. So remember, repetition strengthens those neuron connections. The first few iterations, the brain works really hard. Later on, it works less. The cerebral cortex hands off to that basal ganglia. Sensory inputs are de-emphasized. This is the root cause of a lot of injuries, right? People you think they're not paying attention. Well, they're doing things by rote, and their brain is someplace else. So the basal ganglia recognizes and manages patterns. This is what Duhigg calls the habit cycle. There's a cue. With the rat example, that's when the partition is removed. There's a routine. That's where he's walking through to get to where the reward is, and then there's the reward. Okay? And so, again, once habits are established, they never get erased. Old habits are persistent. People can and will revert to old habits. So this is one of the reasons why it's difficult to sustain a change. People tend to resort to old habits when the reward is greater than the probability of a consequence. They think they can get away with it, right? And the second part is they believe that the old habit is better for them than the new habit. So to maintain new habits, leaders have to consistently provide what's needed for that to enable those new behaviors or those right behaviors. So if you don't upgrade software and they need software to do the task you're asking them to do, it's not their fault, right? You're not providing what they need. The other thing is you have to be attentive and assertive in monitoring behaviors. Now, assertive probably has a negative connotation. You probably are thinking about that as we have to go and confront this person. But remember, positive reinforcement is also being assertive. Okay, and we do far too little positive reinforcement. So we can be attentive, we can notice whether people are doing good or not doing good, and then we can be assertive at giving them positive feedback, telling them that, right, you're doing the right things, I appreciate it, things are going well. Or corrective conversations for non-complying behaviors. That's what we think about all the time when I say assertive, right? So when I get down to it, accountability and leadership capability, that's the combination of those things is what I call productive leadership, right? So being able to put these processes in place and have them be sustained is where we're trying to go. This is what I call the organizational reliability model. And it's when you think about this set of circles on the top, that's the senior person or the supervisor, the manager, whoever the senior person is in the interaction. The bottom set of circles are the direct report. So it could be the plant manager, it could be department head, it could be a shop supervisor in the workforce, right? It's across one level of leadership. And what we're doing with this model is that it does three things. It identifies new guidance, new policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures, and provides the assets, the training, the materials, the tools required to do that. It also, if there's an existing set of guidance and assets, it's to improve those guidance and assets. And the third thing is about executing, right? So think about this, I call this the accountability model because the top person has accountabilities and the bottom person has accountabilities. The top person has the accountability to define the guidance, policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures, and to provide what's needed to actually execute the guidance. The subordinate or the direct report has accountabilities as well. They have accountabilities to execute the current guidance with the current assets. Okay, there's a difference between authorized guidance and authorized assets and current guidance and current assets. That's why you see that circle that encompasses guidance and assets, right? That's the current guidance and assets. That's what the direct report has been provided with. Their accountability is to execute what their tasking is. And their other accountability is this arrow here, to report strengths and weaknesses back up to the senior person. That's the feedback loop. That's listening to your people, right? So the top part of it, let me go through this part. So you have strengths and weaknesses, and you have opportunities and threats that come in. SWOTs, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. What the senior person has to do is assess those. So you collect them all. You prioritize them. You start parsing it out. If it's not my tasking, it's a peer group tasking, right? You start organizing those opportunities, those SWOTs. Then you define the solution, right? Now, the senior person is accountable, but they don't have to also be the responsible person, right? They can delegate that. They can do defect elimination teams. They can do RCA. They can do whatever the tool is that you want to use, HOP tools, right? Those all reside in the define piece. Those two, assess and define, are circumscribed by that circle because at that point you haven't authorized the change yet. You're studying it, you're developing it. Once you get to the point where it's authorized, it moves outside of that circle into implement. And then the downward arrow is put it into practice. The senior person is accountable until the habits are formed, right? They can't dump it on the direct report and say, you handle it. The senior person is accountable, okay? So that, in a nutshell, is what the organizational reliability model is. It applies, as I said, across each level in the organization. This is why it's modular. So if you're a supervisor, you can apply this to your work center. If you're a manager, you can apply it to the supervisors that report to you. If you're the plant manager, you can apply it to your department heads. And if you are the department head, you should also apply it to those assistant managers and supervisors who are under you. As I said, it's modular, right? So there has to be, I say that there should be linked accountabilities, but because it's modular, if you can't get your organization to do this and you're at a low level in the organization, you can still implement it for your responsibilities. So as I said, plant manager to their direct reports, the department managers. You might have, and each person could be both a senior person and a junior person, right? So if I'm a department head, I'm the junior person to the plant manager, so I have execution accountabilities, but I'm also the senior person to the assistant manager, so I have senior person accountabilities, okay? It cascades down through the organization, all the way down to the team members. And so what you have to do is, using this model, you can actually assess where there are deficiencies in accountability in your organization. Okay. So now let's talk about leadership capability. So if you think about this model, I always think about, if you look at the dark blocks, those are the things that an individual leader needs to be provided with. And if you think about this, it looks almost like an electric motor. Those dark blocks would be the bearings, right? The horizontal line would be the shaft, and the personal and position power boxes would be the armature. So what do bearings do in a motor? They support the weight of the shaft and the armature. They align it, right? They allow free rotation. So these are the things that a leader needs to be able to be effective at doing their job. So if you're the senior person and this is a direct report leader, you as a senior person are accountable to provide mission, vision, and values, right? Those are the organization or the team goals. Objectives. These are the organization and team tactical direction, right? What are we trying to accomplish in the current time frame? Then again, the guidance and the assets that came from the organizational reliability model, okay? Now, when most people say that they've gotten leadership training, what they talk about is just this piece, leadership skills, time management, communication, giving and receiving feedback, empowerment, those sorts of things. But as you can see, there's a lot of other activities or knowledge that a productive leader should have. So if you're trying to be a leader, ask for a leadership position if you're only interested in making more money, if you think it's easier than lugging tools around, or you think you've been here long enough that you deserve the position. That's not what you should be doing if you're considering being a leader. What you should be doing is you should have, I always say everybody should have a personal mission, vision, and value set, right? Your mission is what do you mean to the world? Your vision is, what do I want to accomplish in the near term and the midterm? And values, how you want people to perceive you, right? How you're going to accomplish your vision. You should also be comfortable about being accountable for other people and for your team's performance. And you should realize that if your team fails, it's because you didn't do enough to put them in a position to succeed. So let's talk about the rest of those little items in the block. That was the first one. That was the leader. This is leadership roles. Leadership roles are how a leader spends their time while they're in a leadership function. There's expert technician. It is what that sounds like, being an expert in your area. Manager administrator. That's making sure people are getting paid and you're putting the cover sheets on the TPS reports like in the office. Coach is that mentoring piece, how you're developing your people. Systems thinker, that's, remember, the bottom of the organizational reliability model. That's identifying those strengths and weaknesses and coming up with what are those guidance changes that we need to be making. Strengths and weaknesses are internal, opportunities and threats are external, right? So visionary then is the external. So leaders at every level should be dedicating some portion of their time to each of these functions. And your level in the organization dictates how much time you should be spending in each of these functions, right? So you might be working in any one of these 5 or none of them, right? So if you're working on your own personal development, you're not in a leadership role, you're spending 5% of your time, something like that, developing your own personal professional development, right? But when you're in a leadership role, those are the roles that you should be looking at. Good leaders allocate the appropriate amount of time to each. Now we'll move on to leadership attributes. Leadership attributes are these: consistent, attentive, respectful, motivating, and assertive. Yes, the first letter is spelled karma, but it's with a C. I know karma is spelled with a K. I will probably pay for that later. So these are the attributes or characteristics that a leader exhibits. And the reason we do these is we want to develop trust, respect and trust between us, right? We want to respect the people that are our direct reports, and we also want them to respect us. We want to trust them, and we want them to trust us. So if you're consistent, attentive, motivating, respectful, and assertive, you go a long way to getting there. Now the leadership skills, like I said a couple minutes ago, this is what everybody thinks about when they say, yeah, I've had leadership training. It's just the functional pieces, right? The time management, communication, empowerment, giving and receiving feedback, conflict management. Now, I'm going to give you a few little tidbits here as I go through this. One of them is when we talk about empowerment, and we've heard a couple people say this, similar things throughout this week, when you're trying to instill that psychological trust, right? These are the 2 best questions I know in a general leadership scenario. What needs to be done and how would you do it? If you're an expert and you've been promoted to a leadership position, you already know how to do it, and you can probably do it better than the person that you're directing. Okay, great. But how is that person going to be developed if you take on and direct everything? Let that person tell you what they know. Let them be the person to come up with the solution. And if it's good enough, let them do it. They'll learn over time by repetition how to do it better and better. Power. This can be an ugly topic, right? There's position power and personal power. The top three are position powers. Those are power delegated to you just by virtue of the fact that you are in a leadership position. Personal power is how you interact with other people, or the expert power by virtue of the things that you know. The bottom two, information and connection power, those are combinations or hybrids of those two powers. And the key point here is that we should always strive to be leading through personal power. But as one of the speakers said this week, when you need to use position power, you need to use it, right? You can't shy away from it. But we always want to be developing and getting better and better at our personal power, right? That's, again, a trust and respect issue. The next block was influencing, right? Influencing your team members. So sometimes if you empower people and you influence them in the right directions, it can feel like you're losing control because they're running with everything. They got it. You're just kind of there for the ride. To me, that was Shangri-La, because now I could work on the things I wanted to work on. I didn't have to mess with this stuff, right? These guys got it. They know what they're doing. So a leader's job is to get the best long-term performance from their team. If the team underperforms, I view it as because the leader didn't put them in a position to succeed. And believe that the people on your team want to do a good job every day. Ask them what they need to do a good job. Be responsive. Get them what they need. Develop personal power, build trust and respect, right? Focus on individual team members. This is another thing. Make sure you set up on your calendar, if you got 5 direct reports or 10 direct reports, whatever it is, every week, schedule time to go out on the floor, find that person and just spend a few minutes with them, right? Talk to them about the business, how they impact the business results, right? How they impact safety, how they impact whatever. Understand what their personality is. Another thing Mr. Fisher said was the range of personalities. Some people are more amenable or more susceptible to causing errors, right? Know who your people are, what it is that they like and dislike, and how you can empower them. Understand what their objectives are, right? Do they want to go up the technical ladder, or do they want to go up the management ladder, the leadership ladder, right? Help them to solve the problems to get there. And again, people care when they know you care about their professional and technical development, listen to their ideas, act on the good ones, and give reasons why you can't do the other ones if it's appropriate. This is another little tidbit. I think Andy or somebody yesterday was talking about influencing peers and influencing up the chain. And this is something that I learned early on from my mentors. He told me to use the phrase, unless otherwise directed, right? So there's 2 parameters here. One is responsiveness, and the other one is trust and respect. So in the upper right corner where it says sweet spot, that's when the person that you report to or your peers have a lot of trust and respect with you, and they're highly responsive. When you ask them for something or they ask you for something, you're very responsive. On the lower right side, they might be highly responsive, but they don't have trust and respect for you. So what you can do there is whenever there's an issue, you bring them what the issue is, what your solution is, and how you came to that. What you're doing there is getting them comfortable in your thought processes, your knowledge, all those sorts of things, so they can build trust and respect in you. The left side of the model is when the person's not responsive, right? So you know there's some major issue or some issue that needs to be solved, and you keep throwing it up to your boss, and the boss doesn't do anything with it. But you know it has to get solved. That's where I always use the term, unless otherwise directed. So basically, you send them some form of documentation, an email with a date timestamp, or a memo, whatever, and you say, this is what I'm going to do, unless otherwise directed. So what happens? If that person responds and says, no, I don't want you to do it that way, you got a response, right? If they don't respond, you got a response. You're keeping the accountability on that senior person or that peer, okay? Giving and receiving feedback, a lot of people have a lot of difficulty with this, and there's positive and negative, right? So this is an example of negative, but there's a 3-step message. The first is clearly describe the behavior that was noteworthy. So the work orders you've been closing out have been missing parts usage data. The second part is to tell them how you feel about it. Now, when I go into like a mining operation or an oil rig or something like that, and I tell them, talk about your feelings, right? It's kind of funny, but it's not touchy-feel. It's just I don't feel confident or I don't feel comfortable with this, right? So the second thing is tell them how you feel. Because of that, because you're not putting good parts usage data in, I don't feel confident in the data that we have. And then the third part is describe how that behavior affects the team or the organization. So without that data, the plant manager isn't going to approve our purchasing of more critical inventory parts. But you can see how you would also use this for positive reinforcement, right? Hey, the work orders you've been closing out do have good parts usage data. Because of that, I feel confident asking the plant manager to buy us more critical spares, right? So, and then, of course, when things are a little bit more difficult, you use a 6-step process. It's a little bit more formal. State what was observed. You explain your concerns and consequences. You ask for their side, and you be quiet and listen. That's an area where you can definitely lose trust. So review performance expectations. What is it that was supposed to be done? Ask for a commitment to do better, or ask for their recommendations on how to fix what was the problem, keeping them from doing it the right way. Monitor compliance and reinforce the improved behaviors, not just when they mess up again. Give them positive feedback. Think about a bowling alley. When you take a little kid to the bowling alley, they put the guards in the gutters so the kid can't throw a gutter ball. Well, the left side is positive reinforcement, the right side is corrective reinforcement, right? You need to do both. Okay, so again, step 3 is critical. If you don't keep your mouth closed, it can create or destroy trust. Maybe you misinterpreted what you saw. Maybe it was the right action for the wrong reason, or it could be the wrong action by inattention or whatever, right? So listen to them. Don't jump the gun. And then, of course, SMART goals. I think everybody's seen these. Be specific. What precisely do you want to measure, or do you want to have as a goal? What's the quantitative measurement, something that you can physically measure? Is it attainable? And the trick here is when you bring a goal to your team, let them help set the goal. You might say, I would need PM completions right now is at 80%. We need it at 95%. We need it there by the end of the month. Well, we can't get it by the end of the month, but we can get it in 3 months. You'd say, okay. And 9 times out of 10, if you let them stretch it out or let them have a little bit easier goal, they're going to exceed it anyway. Okay? And then attainable, relevant. Why do we want it? How does it go against the objectives, the mission, vision, and values? And then timely, when do we need it by? So summary. Initiatives lose steam and revert to old ways when habits have not been formed. So culture is what most people do most of the time. What people do are behaviors. We can observe behaviors. And to get the right behaviors, productive leaders define and enable the right behaviors. And then remember the model. We need to guide the right behaviors. And then when most people have the right habits, we have the right culture. So define and enable the right behaviors, that's the easy part. Guiding the right behaviors is the hard part. Okay? And accountability and leadership capability. Those are the keys. Okay? And with that, any questions? I know I maybe went over a little bit.
Yes, so at break, so we're going right to break. I suspect Tom's going to go right to his table, which is outside. So if you have questions for Tom at break, catch those outside. But let's give Tom a hand for